So today we're going to dig into this really pivotal moment in the history of global trade. It all comes down to a single year, 1921, where the tides of maritime power completely turned, right there in the locks of the Panama Canal. Let's get into the story of how America's shipping industry pulled off this quiet but massive takeover.
And here we go. This is the main event. It's 1921. Now you have to picture this. The rest of the world is in an economic depression. Ships are just sitting idle in ports everywhere. But something totally remarkable was happening at the Panama Canal. American tonnage, it hit a record high. For the very first time, the Stars and Stripes flew past the Union Jack, carrying an incredible 45% of all cargo. Britain was officially knocked into second place. So the big question is, how on earth did that happen?
Okay, so to really get just how big of a deal this shift was, we first have to understand who was on top. Before 1921, when it came to commercial shipping, the Panama Canal was pretty much British territory. The British Empire was the undisputed master of this waterway.
I mean, just look at these numbers. In the canal's first few years of operation, British shipping was an absolute powerhouse. In 1915, they handled 42% of all traffic. A year later, it peaked at an amazing 45%. Even with World War I raging, Britain's fleet was consistently hauling well over 40% of everything going through the canal.
But, it wasn't all smooth sailing for them. The canal's early years were really volatile. You had these massive landslides in the Gaylord Cut, one of which shut the canal down completely for 7 months back in 1915. And then, of course, the war messed with traffic patterns, creating all kinds of ups and downs. All this disruption, well, it started to create some cracks in the old order, and that set the stage perfectly for a new challenger to rise up.
And that challenger was, you guessed it, the United States. So let's take a look at the key strategic advantages that allowed American shipping to not just catch up, but to completely surge ahead after the war.
All right, the first and probably most important factor was what you could call a home field advantage. See, U.S. law made it so that all domestic sea trade, so anything going between the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, was an American monopoly. Foreign ships were totally shut out. This created this protected, high-volume baseline of traffic that no other country could even touch. So after the war, when American ships came back to this route, the volume just exploded.
So what were they shipping? We're not talking about small stuff here. We're talking about huge quantities of really valuable goods. For the first time ever, big chunks of the northwestern apple crop and California's famous oranges were being shipped east by sea. Then, you add a massive increase in lumber shipments from the Pacific coast, and boom, you've got a recipe for a coast-to-coast trade bonanza.
The second key driver? Black gold, oil. The Mexican oil boom created this massive new trade route for petroleum, all of it feeding the hungry industrial engines of the United States. And American tankers completely dominated this trade. They were carrying almost half the oil heading to South America and a staggering 60% of the oil going to the U.S. Pacific coast. This was a whole separate layer of traffic that was heavily in America's favor.
So, with these new advantages kicking in, what did the direct competition actually look like? Let's break down the strategies of these two maritime giants, head-to-head.
And here are the raw numbers for that critical year, 1921. It's a clean sweep for the United States. Over 1,200 American vessels to Britain's 970. Almost 5 million net tons to Britain's 4 million. And the big one, over 5 million tons of cargo compared to Britain's 3.7 million. So the key takeaway here is that the U.S. wasn't just a little bit ahead. It was ahead by a huge margin across every single important metric.
This really shows you the stark difference in their game plans. On one side, you've got America's engine, that protected, high-volume, coast-to-coast domestic route. And on the other side, you see Britain's global network. They were relying on these long-haul imperial routes, connecting the UK with places like Australia and New Zealand and their partners in South America.
Now, Britain's global strategy involved some pretty clever logistics, something called circular trade. It's a cool concept. A British ship might sail from Europe to, say, Australia, through the Suez Canal, and then come back home through the Panama Canal. It creates this super efficient around-the-world loop. It shows you how these two great canals were becoming partners, not just rivals, in global trade.
But in America's own backyard, it was a totally different story. Just look at the fight for the west coast of South America. When it came to trade with the U.S., American ships absolutely dominated. They were carrying 45% of the cargo heading south, and an incredible 64% of the cargo heading north. Britain, the former powerhouse in the region, they were left with just about 15%.
And the very structure of their fleets was completely different too. American maritime power was this mix of the government's own U.S. shipping board and private industrial giants like Standard Oil and U.S. Steel.
Britain's power, though, was way more concentrated. A single private company, the Pacific Steam Navigation Company, accounted for a whopping 44% of all British ships using the canal.
So you might be wondering, was this just a one-year fluke? A temporary blip caused by the weird post-war economy? Well, the evidence shows pretty clearly that the shift in 1921 was permanent. It was the beginning of a whole new era.
And the proof is right here. Just check out the data from less than a year later, in May of 1922. American tonnage didn't just hold steady, it accelerated. U.S. ships now accounted for a full 50% of the canal's entire market share, carrying more than half of all the cargo. So yeah, the 1921 shift wasn't an anomaly. It was the start of a trend that was only getting stronger.
The transition was done. It was complete. That combination of a recession-proof domestic monopoly, the new logic of global trade, and explosive post-war industrial growth, it all meant the American era of the Panama Canal had officially begun. The torch had been passed.
Which, of course, leaves us with one last big thought. This isn't just a story about ships and cargo tons. It's about a fundamental transfer of global power. How did this strategic shift in this one narrow strip of water in Central America end up signaling the dawn of what we would later call the American century? Now that is something to think about.